from the heart of where innovation, money, and power collide. In Silicon Valley and beyond, this is Bloomberg Technology with Emily Chang.
I'm Hyde in New York, in for Emily Chang, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, U.S. equities rose for a second day. That's as economic data and, well, actually some hope surrounding Russia's war with Ukraine started to impact investors' choices. We'll bring you the latest in terms of the market moves. Plus, the growing cyber threat out of Russia after Ukraine's institutions were attacked. How big of a risk is there for the West as well? More on that later. And the amount of misinformation spreading online in the wake of Russia's invasion is growing. How platforms are handling their role in a burgeoning war. We'll get to all of that in but a moment. But first, the prospect of talks between Russia and Ukraine has been cast, well, hope, then doubt. The Kremlin saying Kiev stopped responding after rejecting Moscow's initial offer for a meeting in Minsk, Belarus. Bloomberg's Marguerita Kanaev is here with more, and in an odd way, the market seemed to grasp onto this hope that there could be talks between Ukraine and Russia. But tell us about the real truth here.
Well, if there were to be, really the timing and the location would be incredibly important. So Russia first decided that they would like to hold these talks in Minsk, Belarus, but that's not going to happen given the fact that Lukashenko has allowed Russian troops to stay in Belarus and use that as a base to then invade on Ukraine from the northern border. And the Belarus border to the capital of Kiev is about 2.5 hours or 3 hours, depending on which side of that river you drive upon. So this is going to be incredibly interesting if these talks were to happen. But of course, one thing on the table is that President Putin wants is a veto on Ukraine joining NATO, basically neutralize Ukraine in terms of whether or not it would join NATO or not. And Ukraine has constantly said they want to maintain that path to NATO membership and keep that door open.
Meanwhile, therefore, next steps that you're going to be paying attention to as we head towards the weekend. We've had so much of a global narrative, China weighing in. We've looked at other key leaders in the UK and NATO leaders. What next in terms of next steps for you?
So today was really about upping the sanctions against Russia. So we saw that European capitals, as well as the White House, just confirming about an hour ago with Press Secretary Jen Psaki talking about the fact that they are going ahead with sanctioning Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, as well as President Putin himself. But this is largely symbolic, given most of his assets are relatively skim. That's official assets. But what's going to happen for the weekend, I think, is really going to depend on what happens on the ground in Ukraine. I imagine if there's anything on the diplomacy front, it'll be a lot of phone calls, but they'll probably wait until Monday, Caroline, if there's any more of this upping of the risk or the potential penalties for Russia when it comes to sanctions.
Anne-Marie Horden, one of the busiest women out there this week. We hope you managed to get some rest. Thank you so much for that. Meanwhile, of course, the conflict in Ukraine's been top of mind all week, but investors maybe taking a breath ahead of the weekend, maybe trying to reallocate amid what had been a significant sell-off during Thursday's trade to then rally higher. Ed Ludlow, bring us the Friday big moves for us.
Yeah, I think you're right to position this as hope rather than substance on the talks between Ukraine and Russia. But a lot of green on the screen. You see there the S&P 500, the main gauge of US equities, up 2.25%. It's the biggest jump in a month, and it almost makes you forget the volatility of the week, right? Such big declines over Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday sessions because of what we saw in Ukraine. The NASDAQ 100, though, very tech-heavy index, kind of underperforming because don't forget, traders are trying to make up their mind now where we stand with the Fed and the outlook for rates. So note the US 10-year yield there at 1.96%. Had been a little higher earlier on Friday. We're off by about a basis point, softer by a basis point. So a lot to consider going into the weekend, but a sigh of relief, which is interesting. Going to skip ahead to semiconductors. Semiconductors, really interesting one. A big focus of Thursday's sanctions package was restricting access to technology for Russia, semiconductors being a big part of that. You see the stocks, yes, we underperform the S&P 500, but we're still up 1.6%. Well, those that are willing to discuss it semiconductor company is saying, well, if supply isn't going to Russia, we have a long list of customers waiting for chips. We'll just send it somewhere else. Demand is so great. NVIDIA are also interesting. They coming out with statements saying that they have had some kind of hack to their internal systems, not doing too much to the stock. It actually rose and saw a late gain in Friday's session, up 1.7%. And Ford up 4%, despite idling one of its most profitable lines in Kansas City for the F-150. Why, Caroline? Shortage of semiconductors. Very quickly, let me talk about Dell, because 24 hours ago, you and I were so focused on Russia, Ukraine. This is Dell over the last 6 days. 6 straight days of declines. We had earnings for the fourth quarter Thursday night, a weak profit outlook. Why? Supply chain disruptions, rising costs. They can't service demand. I'm going to be mean. I know I shouldn't do this on a Friday, but let me just read to you this long list of superlatives. The biggest drop since April 2020 for the stock on Friday. At one point, it was facing the biggest drop on record. The stock is at its lowest level since September, and this run of 6 days of declines is the worst streak of declines since October of 2020. So something clearly not going right for Dell. Of course, such a legacy name in the world of technology. You might have missed that one for everything that's been going on in the world in the last 24 hours.
Well done for shining a light on it, because there's plenty we're missing amid, well, what is a turbulent time in geopolitics and indeed the markets. Ed Ludlow, we thank you. Let's get even more insight on the tech sector's slightly remarkable moves. Dan Ives of Wedbush, who, of course, at the beginning of this week had said that really the situation in Ukraine couldn't have come at a worse time for tech. And then the bounce back. What is this? Is this that, you know, we'd seen so many bearish bets put on, that we'd seen so many shorts already, that we sort of see the bounce back now?
Look, I think it's the most oversold. It's the most oversold that I've seen tech stocks in the last 6 years. And I think that's essentially what's really playing out here. I think it was oversold in terms of tech, and now you're really starting to see a bounce back, especially with what's happened with the Fed. It's going to be a slower Fed hike. That's starting to get factored in, 50 bips off the table, and it's oversold in terms of tech. That's why we saw the bounce back.
Therefore, if we start to reassess what happens March 16th, if we don't think we're going to get a double hike, a 50 basis point move, if we start to tamper down our expectations for 6, 7 rate hikes over the course of the year, who wins then in the tech sector?
I think it's a combo. I think you got to look at this. The large caps are going to be safety. Names like Microsoft, Apple, Intel, Cisco, safety blanket names. I think you see more and more rotation toward tech. I think you're starting to see a little more of a risk on, dipping the toe in the water. And then you look at cybersecurity. I think some of these cybersecurity names, in my opinion, it's going to be the sector of tech that probably outperforms the most, not just because I think valuations, the overall growth, and then you look at the Ukraine situation, that's going to be potentially a 200 to 300 bip tailwind. Names like Palo Alto, CrowdStrike, Zscaler, or Okta, among others. And then that's why this is one. You go into the weekend, despite the horrific situation in Ukraine, at least from a stock market perspective, tech feels like that oversold. And I think we're starting to put some sort of bottom in here, at least on tech.
Okay, interesting. And your perspective in terms of, you know, the allocation to big tech as a haven or not. Do you think that it rides that wave in some way, or is this really about trying to understand the valuation element to it all?
I think part of it is valuations are way oversold, you know, relative. Obviously, from the beginning of the year, we've seen most tech down 20%, a lot of these down 40, 50%. Relative to growth, I think it's some of the most attractive valuations we've seen going back 2015, 2016. But I think when you look at overall growth, which is important, that's not changing because of the situation here. And I think when you look at overall tech, that's really what's, I think, resonating with investors in terms of some of these levels.
And lastly, what's sort of been overlooked perhaps is also some of the idiosyncratic news, some of the M&A news, you know, Zendesk terminating deals. Are we expecting fewer combinations here, consolidation here? Is there still plenty of opportunity to be had when we're thinking of those sorts of eventualities to make us want to get into certain tech names?
Oh, I think there's going to be actually an acceleration of M&A because of what you're seeing on some of the oversold names from a valuation perspective. I think names like Microsoft are going to be aggressive when it comes to specific areas like cybersecurity. I think you'll see strategic M&A as well as financial. And this is something I think behind the scenes, you have a lot of investors really focused on, which are some of these oversold names you'd be looking at. I think a lot of them are names like cybersecurity, and some of the cloud names in particular, just way oversold.
Dan Ives on the technicals, as well as some of the fundamentals at play. We thank you so much of Wedbush. He's just been a font of knowledge when it comes to checking out what's on the Bloomberg terminal as well amid these dramatic days. Coming up, well, the growing threat of cyber attacks, which has been talking about the opportunity to buy into the stocks. Well, what about what's actually happening on the ground? Russia attacking Ukrainian servers during its military invasion. Could we expect a global cyber warfare here? We're going to be talking with Mandiant's Sandra Joyce. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
You don't have to move tanks, you don't have to move armories, you can just use your keyboard to get across what you think is an active art of war in an asymmetric manner. So it's also something very difficult to move back against. So for example, if Russia strikes us with a cyber blow, what is the US going to do? And so that's definitely what he conceives as an excellent use of his arsenal.
That was former U.S. Assistant Secretary for Homeland Security Matt Hayden there, talking about the threat of cyber attacks from Russia, not just on Ukraine, but also here in the West. Let's bring in Mandiant's Head of Global Intelligence, Sandra Joyce, to talk a little bit more about that. The most phenomenal resume in terms of the amount of, well, master's degrees that you hold in cyber policy and international affairs. Just talk to us in the here and now, Sandra, what you are telling your clients, how worried they need to be.
Well, what we're telling them is that they need to be prepared, but not to panic. The fact of the matter is that Russian cyber aggression has been going on for many years. And a lot of the preparations that organizations are making for ransomware and other attacks that are the same preparations that we're asking them to make today.
Any industry groups that are more vulnerable than others, or indeed that you feel could be under greater threat than others?
Well, the risk of reciprocal action against or cyber action against U.S. businesses, the risk of that does go up with the application of sanctions. And when we're looking at reciprocity, a lot of the sanctions are based on financial effects. We might expect to see some action against the financial sector, but it wouldn't be just limited to the financial sector if it were to happen. And that's because cyber attacks can create effects across all industries. And that is really what I believe the Russian aggression is about. It's about creating fear, doubt, uncertainty, and that's going to be very powerful if they can actually get that done.
Fear, doubt, uncertainty was certainly increased in Ukraine amid, well, not one, but two cyber attacks, which seem to be more DDoS, distributed denial of service attacks, an inability to communicate, particularly with their front lines. But I'm interested in what types of attacks you might see in the Ukraine, but also perhaps closer to home. Is it that sort of attack, or is it more ransomware that we need to fear?
Well, what we should be thinking about is what is the effect that the Russian government would be trying to get. So they could use a very low sophistication technique like a DDoS attack. But what is accompanying with that are things like text messages. We saw this in Ukraine, text messages going out to banking customers, telling them that the banks were down, that they wouldn't be able to get their money. That is an effect that's really cognitive. It's psychological. I think that what we're going to be seeing from that Russian playbook is a psychological attachment to any of the cyber actions that they're taking, trying to drive down the resolve of the people. The application of sanctions and their effectiveness is really driven by the willingness of the people to support them. And if Russia can get their target population, whether it's in Ukraine or elsewhere, to start doubting their government, to weaken their resolve, then they will have achieved the effect that they're looking for.
Okay, so give us as a consumer, but also the clients that you speak to, a sort of quick 101 of what we should be looking for, how we should be acting in this current environment.
Well, really what we need to be doing is looking for anomalies in our networks. We should already be practicing cyber hygiene. Run that playbook. If you know that you're going to be taking actions, separating networks or segmenting them, who's responsible for that? Is your general counsel part of your tabletop exercises? If not, they should be. And a lot of this will also require a connection to your PR or media relations team, because if you are a target of significance, there certainly is going to be a lot of messaging around that. In fact, you can expect things like defacements or a narrative come out that could be completely fabricated. So really what organizations need to be doing is to prepare in the way that they would be preparing for any ransomware attack or any type of other breach of their network, get the playbook in place, and then remediate and press on, because our resilience is very important here. It's essential not to panic. Companies get breached every day, and they do continue once the remediation is complete.
We, of course, talk a lot about defense. But we've started for, I feel like, the first time to hear from potentially the administration and talk about offense when it comes to cyber, well, attack to a certain degree. What do you think could be deployed to be able to, take it back upon Russia in some way?
Well, the U.S. military, of course, has every option available to them, and it doesn't need to be a cyber response. In fact, if military action were to come, there would be quite a few different options. But one thing to remember here is there are multiple instruments of national power. If the United States decides that it's going to go on offense, it can go on offense in many ways, diplomatically, economically, even within the breadth of military tools. There are low-level, things that can be done, all the way to some of the more sophisticated attacks that could happen. But really, it's not about the mode and mean of it. What it is, it's about the effect. What effect do you want to reach? And how is the most efficient application that you can put out there to gain that effect?
And quickly, Sandra, the people, the places these attacks are coming from, is it becoming easier and easier to identify very quickly? Because that seemed to have been what the case was, to ensure that we knew that these were coming from Russia, even if it wasn't exactly from the government itself.
Well, we do know quite a bit about the Russian threat, cyber threat apparatus. Over the several years that they have been conducting attacks, not only the governments, but also commercial companies like my own have enumerated a lot of their capabilities. And so we know quite a bit about them. They've been operating in safe harbor in Russia or in adjacent areas for quite a number of years. So a lot is known about them. The thing that gets tricky is that it is they've been operating in an area where we have thus far not had jurisdiction or a lot of options in order to stop the activity.
Really great to get your expertise amid this current environment. Sandra Joyce, Mandiant Executive Vice President and Head of Global Intelligence. Pretty busy woman, I think. Meanwhile, coming up, YouTube, massively popular in Russia, and now Google is facing pressure to cut back on ties to pro-Russian channels as countries continue to sanction Russia. We'll discuss the knock-on effect for some US-based businesses. This is Bloomberg. So with sanctions on Russia ramping up following its invasion of Ukraine, certain companies like, Google's YouTube are under pressure to remove or cut commercial ties with some of its most prolific pro-Russian channels. For more on this story, I'm joined by Bloomberg's Mark Bergen, who covers Google, of course, Alphabet, the parent company, and done a great deep dive on this. Just how deep do these relationships run, Mark?
Yeah, that's hard to say. It's kind of a repeat of 2017. If you remember, there was a lot of criticism around Russia Today and Russian influence after the 2016 election. That clearly a lot of that was around some of the bot networks that hit Facebook and Twitter. But on YouTube, Russia Today advertised itself. You can go look at their English page as the world's most popular news channel on YouTube. They're tremendously successful, over 4 million subscribers. They built up, in part with a very aggressive digital strategy, and they're part of a network. There's some analysts that estimate close to 100 channels that have commercial ties to entities that are they've been under sort of lesser sanctions prior to this past week. And now there are, the EU and the UK and the US are introducing new sanctions that impact individuals, either prominent TV journalists that have YouTube channels or members of the close to the Kremlin that have connections with Russian media. And a lot of Russian media is very popular on YouTube.
Interesting. So how does one go about cutting it? I mean, before we've seen them label, indeed, sort of some of these sorts of state-funded videos and channels, but do you just cut it off entirely? How do you control it?
So, at this point, YouTube's only kind of come out and said that they're paying a lot of attention to misinformation. And that's been something we saw Senator Warner kind of call that out. His term was propaganda. The clear, I think, commercial ties with YouTube is they run ads, right? They have a revenue split with all their YouTube channels. And so every ad you go and see, I was just looking earlier this morning, a lot of these, at least in the US, they run commercials. That's a split with YouTube. YouTube could decide to demonetize and no longer run ads on those channels, which they have in some cases. There's even some former Google lawyers that are sort of calling for them to make more drastic measures and actually cut those channels off entirely. Interesting.
Once again, very difficult conversations, I'm sure, being had at an executive level, Mark. Is the response also, though, if it's not on Alphabet's own YouTube, it's being forced elsewhere? How much are we seeing still YouTube being used by such news organizations or indeed state-funded organizations, or are they going on to other parts of the internet?
So YouTube's been prominent. I mean, what the interesting thing about YouTube is that it's both popular in Russia for a lot of these state-backed media and sort of pro-Kremlin media. It's also been a huge asset for the opposition. Navalny, who's the opposition leader, has a massively popular YouTube channel. YouTube often likes to point out that in a country with tight controls of state media and broadcast, YouTube does offer avenues for criticism, and I think that's a fair and valid point. What's also happening is that they are under incredible amounts of pressure even prior to this past week from the Russian government there's been this contention around a particular YouTube channel that YouTube blocked. And then there was a court fine, and now they're paying a regular daily fine. Google is. They're under increasing pressure along with Facebook and Twitter to take down accounts that the Russian government has told them are either extremist or using the guise of misinformation.
Mark Bergen, it's a great story. Go and read it. Google faces sanctions dilemma with pro-Russia YouTube channels. We thank you so much for breaking it all down for us. Stay well. Meanwhile, coming up, we continue the conversation on social media's role in all of this, really. Facebook, of course, parent company Meta, now weighing in after Russia said it was limiting access to the platform. We'll be discussing the ramifications, the roles, the duties, and the difficult conversations probably being held at executive levels across social media in the US. This is next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Caroline Hyde in New York. Now, as we headed into the end of what was a pretty tense week, to say the least, investors still making sense of how to navigate the situation, of course, between Russia and Ukraine. Ed Ludlow is here with what has been a remarkable rally, actually, into the end of the week.
Yeah, it has. And you're trying to work out what your exposure is in financial markets. You're also trying to work out which companies and stocks are going to be impacted in the short and long term. And this is a discussion we've got to have around social media. Meta, parent company of Facebook, and also Twitter, of course. Meta coming out saying that Russian authorities ordered them to stop fact-checking and labeling posts on the Facebook platform by state-run media, to which Facebook declined to do so. An interesting analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence jumped on this really quickly, saying that in the case of Meta, you could see 1 to 2 percentage points of a hit to daily active users. But which company might benefit here? Twitter. Really interesting. We know this from the Olympics, right? We know this from the Super Bowl. Twitter is an event-driven platform, and Bloomberg Intelligence estimating they could actually get a short-term boost for their active users from what's going on the ground in Russia and Ukraine, no matter how tense and difficult it is to see from afar. It's also interesting to see where capital's flowing. We look at some of the ETFs. I'd love to take a look at the ETF space on a Friday, Caroline. ARK is a name so familiar to us, right? This is the big fund, Cathie Wood and ARK. Money's been going into this fund last couple of days. Big gains over a 2-day basis, I think 10.5% over the last 48 hours or so. But if you compare that to the Van Eck Russia ETF, which also saw a big rebound on Friday and saw inflows, you have to ask about what the psychology of investors is here, because this was a big rebound, right, in the Van Eck ETF. That was a massive drop Wednesday, Thursday. This is an ETF that tracks Russian equities. Now you have people coming in. Are these bottom feeders? Are these guys coming in trying to buy the bottom, or are they looking at shorting Russian equities, short interest in that ETF gaining as well? But what's the rationale of going into ARK? If you look at the performance of these ETFs relative to their 52-week highs, or over the last 12 months, in other words, we bring up the next board, there's a real difference in what's going on here. These are two very different ETFs tracking very different basket of stocks. But on a 52-week basis, or a drawdown from a 52-week high, we are in pretty much the same place. So the point I'm making is investors seem to take stock on Friday and say, I'm going to go back into technology stocks. I'm going to go back a little bit into this ETF that's tracking Russian equities and see what my exposure is going forward.
Ed Ludlow, great way to wrap up an extraordinary week. We thank you so much. Now, we want to turn our attention to the role of social media in what's currently occurring in Ukraine. Russia, of course, no stranger to peddling disinformation, especially now as it tries to shape the narrative of the war it created. It announced that it was restricting use of Facebook due to the company fact-checking content posted by state-run media. In a statement, Meta's Nick Clegg wrote, in part, ordinary Russians are using Meta's apps to express themselves and organize for action. We want them to continue to make their voices heard, share what's happening, and organize. For more on all of this, I'm very pleased to be joined by Marguerita Kanaev. She's the Associate Director for the Center of Security and Emerging Technology, along with Brett Schaefer. He's a Senior Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Rita, first and foremost, what's the playbook we're currently seeing out of Russia at the moment?
I think it's been a standard combination of things that we've seen before with an influx of some news messaging. It is a reiteration of the narrative that NATO expansion has driven Russia to defend itself, which is obviously a disinformation tactic designed to justify the current attacks and a lot of the probably atrocities that we'll be seeing increasingly so. Another emphasis is being put at dissuading ordinary Russians from taking a stand against the conflict and against the war. And I think we're soon are also going to be seeing an argument that those domestic protests are being driven by external CIA fomented, those points that we've seen before. So in combination of targeting domestic audiences as well as looking externally, it's tools that Russia has honed in its previous disinformation campaigns in Ukraine and then in Syria, and now we're seeing it repeated again in a way that has been difficult to tackle for those media companies that you discussed earlier.
Yeah, Brett, difficult to tackle, and particularly when Russia's sort of saying no longer wants to be using the Meta platform in that respect. How do you see social media companies such as YouTube, owned by Google, Alphabet, Meta's Facebook and Instagram, how do you see them being able to respond to this in the real time?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a real moment of reckoning for the U.S. social media companies. I mean, for years, they have tried to be neutral platforms where they have allowed different perspectives to exist. Yes, they have labeled Russian state media outlets as being Russian state media outlets, but they've also labeled U.S. government-funded state media outlets. I think at some point, they may be forced into taking sides here. And frankly, that choice may not be theirs, because I think the Russian government is going to continue to crack down on Western social media companies. Of course, we saw that today. But I think it's possible, if not likely, at some point that the Russian government, if this conflict continues to escalate, that they will just cut off access to Twitter, Facebook, Google for their own domestic population.
And to that end, Rita, how effective would that be? Of course, we all know a VPN when we want to use one, but I'm interested as to what outlets already people are using, how much perhaps Russian people have preempted the fact that it might be harder to access certain Western providers.
Absolutely. And I think in modern society, you can never really hermetically seal a country anymore, especially a country that has already been integrated into the outside world. We're not talking about North Korea here or even China. We're talking about a country that has been, Ukraine itself has been fully integrated into Europe, and even the great parts of Russia are been European facing. So the apps that, even if we're seeing, reduced access to Facebook, we just talked about YouTube being a meaningful platform that regular Russians follow. They also use WhatsApp and Telegram, and those are apps that will continue to be a way for people to communicate. At the same time, unfortunately, we're also seeing the spread of disinformation there. So I don't think Russia will be able to hermetically seal the internet as we know it here, but there's no argument that they will try to control the information that is reaching Russian citizens much more tightly.
And Brett, to that point, how is a good way of layman terms to be ensuring that you're not being targeted by misinformation, that we're not? I mean, we just heard of the cyber attacks that could occur, the ways in which they're sending text messages to people and the like. How do you feel that from a social media perspective, people can really try to, with rigor, understand what's true, what's not?
Russia has significant information capabilities. And that starts, of course, with their state media outlets that are very active. They're very successful across multiple social media platforms. Those are the easy ones to deal with because we know what they are. They're attributable. So they can be labeled. Information consumers understand where the information is coming from and the intent behind it. What gets a little bit trickier is Russia also has significant capabilities in the covert space. So we know that they've run troll farms. They've run pages presenting themselves as being sort of genuine American political opinion pages, but of course have been connected back to Russia. So they have ways of messaging and a capability that doesn't make it entirely clear where the information is coming from. This is even very difficult for the social media companies to ferret out. So as information consumers, I think we just have to remain vigilant and very skeptical because Russia has ways of reaching us that don't necessarily come through outlets that identify themselves as having a connection to the Russian government.
And Rita, very briefly, the amount that's been spent by certain companies to beef up the AI, to ensure they can take down bots, to be a fact checker of choice. Do you think that's enough? Is there still so much work to be done, or have they done all they can to a certain extent?
I think there's a lot more to be done, and not just in that automatic false actor bot space. There's a lot to be done in an area that we're uncomfortable to deal with, and it is the fact that, like Brett mentioned, there are what appears to be legitimate Western political opinion formers that are then later discovered to be Russian bots or Russian influencers masquerading somebody else. At the same time, we are also dealing with actual real people in the West who are of political influence one way or another, who are, whether intentionally or unintentionally, end up amplifying a lot of the Russian messaging. And that is something that I think Americans and people throughout Europe should be much more cognizant of.
Hold ourselves to account too. Marguerita Kanaev, we thank you so much. Brett Schaefer, real expertise from you both. We thank you for it. Have a good weekend. Meanwhile, coming up, the fight over control for information in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We're talking with Arweave, a decentralized storage network built on a blockchain-like data structure, and it's designed to provide permanent data storage, safe from state censorship. We'll discuss. This is Bloomberg. Now, of course, crypto has been a focus throughout the Ukraine-Russia tension, in large part because of the price moves, but also because of the ways in which maybe some oligarchs could or could not be using the technology. But also, let's talk a little bit about how we could use the technology, the underlying technology, not ideally blockchain per se, but this time Blockweave is something that we could be looking at. Arweave is a Berlin-based blockchain startup that built an archival platform for permanent data storage. as a means to actually counter state censorship of online information sources. Arweave founder Sam Williams joins us now. I'm very pleased to say so too does our lead in our crypto discussions, Bloomberg Sonali Basak. And Sonali, I want you to take it away first with Sam.
Yeah, Sam, I think this situation in Ukraine is such an interesting example of where storage decentralized could be applicable. Can you explain what's happening when it comes to Ukraine and the types of information you're able to store in a decentralized way?
Yes, well, we think that in order to learn from the past effectively, we need to store the past in such a way that it's not going to be altered over time. So we built a ledger that is decentralized in nature. It stores its information in hundreds, if not thousands of places across the world, and then backs that storage with a sustainable endowment. And essentially what our community has done has created archiving bots that are putting approximately 1 million pieces of data a day into this system and replicating it around the world such they can't be altered in essentially forever.
Can you tell us a little bit about whether or not we're already seeing your technology being used? How are you deploying effectively an ability to ensure that what is currently being written in history remains so?
Well, we use cryptography to back the system in order to make sure that information can't be changed once it's put inside the network. And then we have a system similar to proof of work with Bitcoin, except we use storage, essentially storing the data set as the work in the system. And that proves that the data has not changed over a large period of time.
I'm wondering how people use the data after it's stored. You have this instance, for example, where Senator Pat Toomey had talked about Arweave's use of the technology in order to store work when it comes to Apple Daily in China, and the inability for the government to erase the information that surrounded Apple Daily. So how then does the US or other people and actors and governments start to take a look at the data that is being stored?
Well, I think the key thing is that information is available all across the world, not just in the US. So when a piece of data is stored inside Arweave, you can collect that data from hundreds, if not thousands, of different places. So while China may have successfully, unfortunately, removed the Stand or Apple Daily from the internet, they really can't remove access to Arweave in any serious fashion. And that means that information is still available to local populace if they want to access it.
Just remind us of course, with every of the protocol tends to come a token, the Arweave token in particular. How is it incentivizing people to be using your particular provision? How many people are?
Using it on the storing side or on the hosting side, if you will. So, well, either way, it's about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people on the storing side. And then there's hundreds to thousands, depending on the time, about 900 right now, I think, data storers that are replicating that information around the world.
Well, speaking of funds, and you're announcing a fundraise, right? So what will you do with the funds? You have some really interesting large backers, Andreessen Horowitz, Blockchain Capital, Coinbase Ventures. To what degree can you grow using the new funds?
Well, I mean, we've taken investment from many different people over the years, and also many of those people that you just mentioned also bought the tokens just from the open market. But the key thing for us, I think, is backing new founders in the ecosystem that are using the technology that we've created to new use cases. So, for example, OurDrive, projects in the Arweave ecosystem, just raised $18 million in order to create enterprise solutions on top of the system that allow businesses to store their data in perpetuity as well, which, of course, is very important for compliance reasons sometimes.
We want to be thanking you for your time, Sam Williams, of course, Arweave founder, and we want to thank Sonali Basak for helping us bring that interview, and clearly some use cases currently being evolved as we look between the Russia and Ukraine invasion. Coming up, what we can learn from Russia's history of cyber attacks and be better prepared against future threats. That's next. This is Bloomberg. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's been, of course, accompanied by cyber attacks, actually preempting it to a certain extent. And now the question arises, how do you prepare for cyber conflict? Can you glean hints from history? Our next guest has some insights into just that. Chet Wisniewski is a threat hunter of sorts at security software company Sophos. It is great to have some time with you. And Chet, talk to us about what we've learned in previous years, we've learned what perhaps sanctions do to Russia in their response. What has their response been in terms of cyber?
Well, it's been quite a history. Most nation states haven't really been caught doing too much, but with Russia, there was a lot of information to mine. They started doing cyber attacks against Estonia back in 2007 and followed that with attacks against Georgia a little after that. Of course, there were attacks during the Crimean invasion in 2014. We've even seen them mess with Kyrgyzstan and other countries as well. And so we were kind of able to kind of put together a bit of a map of things, as you see there on the screen. And depending on the types of attacks, there's always a bit of a pattern to it, which is what we call denial of service, but in essence, taking down, news and government websites, that kind of thing, to create confusion, followed by a lot of other types of attacks.
Talk to us about the other types, because we've seen the DDoS attacks so far, in particular affecting Ukraine, but what next?
Well, we saw a little bit of activity earlier this week just before the land invasion, which is, again, something we've seen before in Russian operations, which are not attributed to Russia yet by any government agency, but it's suspected these so-called wiper attacks, which in essence is a computer virus that gets on your computer, and instead of stealing information or things like that, it simply wipes the hard disk so the computer is inoperable to sort of disrupt things. And we did see some of that on Wednesday this week, right before the land invasion.
Interesting, and we're just talking to Sam Williams of Blockweave about how to be protecting your data and ensuring it can be stored for longer periods of time. What about people in terms of how stressed the systems already are by the fact that many people are working from home at the moment? Have we got the level of cybersecurity that we should have? Have we learned the lessons of past?
Unfortunately, our cybersecurity is not in good shape anywhere globally, and in particularly in Ukraine, where resources were more limited than perhaps we have in the West financially. But the pandemic has not helped us either, right? We've opened more remote doors to provide access to our networks and our information than we normally would have, say, publicly facing, and as a result, that is that many more opportunities for criminals or nation states to exploit that openness.
And in past, we've of course talked about the vulnerability of infrastructure, in particular power infrastructure and the like. Is that what we should be suspecting this time? What does history tell us about where we should look for vulnerabilities going forward?
It's really hard to say. I mean, I'm not a political scientist, so I don't want to comment too much on the politics of it, but it would certainly seem at this point we've moved into a phase where sort of non-state actors are taking over as sort of patriotic hackers, if you will. The Ukrainian President Zelensky called on Ukrainian patriots to try to hack back at Russia. We've already, throughout the day today, it's been evolving. We've seen several criminal groups that are largely believed to be based in Russia make public proclamations that they're going to come after U.S. and Western assets and retribution for the sanctions or whatever other penalties we're imposing on Russia.
And so that's ransomware, is it, that they'll be coming after, do you think?
Certainly, ransomware groups of the ones that have been shattering, that's for sure. They're not limited to ransomware necessarily. The one particular ransomware group known as Conti has, in our experience, performed some of these wiping attacks when they weren't paid the ransom in a previous ransom attempt. So they could certainly get even nastier than taking our data and simply abuse access they may have already, footholds that they have inside of Western assets, and just delete things to be disruptive.
Chet, how many calls are you getting at the moment? So what are you doing to help your clients?
Well, it's a busy time, and the challenge for each individual organization is identifying what their weaknesses are, and on short notice, what they may be able to do to try to mitigate some of the risk of being victimized. And so, there's been a lot of long, well thought out conversations with some of the larger clients, just having conversations about what can you do right now to make the best of the situation, and what do you watch for to know that something may be underway where you may want to batten down the hatches?
One thing that we should look for?
Well, certainly we've seen a lot of abuse of unpatched networking equipment. So back to that COVID pandemic question, all of us working from home with VPNs and things, the Russians have persistently abused those flaws when they're not fixed. And so certainly making sure those fixes are applied and monitoring the network very careful for unusual activity, especially things that may involve, large quantities of data being transported at off hours are often signs of an extortion or ransomware attack.
Chet, really good to speak with you. Thank you so much. Chet Wisniewski.
Thank you very much.
Principal Research Scientist at Sophos. Meanwhile, that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. You want to stick around, though. Wall Street Week is up next. My colleague David Weston, of course, leading that, as always. Larry Summers there to discuss, and a real deep dive into an extraordinary week in where we actually saw US benchmarks close the week higher. He's going to be joined by Jane Harmon, president of the Wilson Center, alongside Kate Moore, CEO of BlackRock Global Allocation Team, and former Treasury Secretary, as I mentioned, Larry Summers. Stay with him from a clearer New York, wishing you all a well weekend. This is Bloomberg.